the quiet architecture of ordinary. Brighton's mornings like to lay a sharp light across the surface of the sea. Along the streets near the shore, the smell of salt settled on the sea-facing windows of stone houses like a thin veil, and the gulls, unchanging through summer and winter, kept time with the city's awakening. Ava Whitmore was one of those trying to find a place within that rhythm. Though she was the only child of a wealthy family, she clung to a quiet kind of normal. By day, she worked in the back room of a small bookshop cafe, and in the evenings she walked by the water, training herself to stand in spaces where her own voice would be small and the voices of others would be large. Her family name worked like a key that opened most doors by itself. She, however, wished to forget that key in a drawer at home. On an evening when it was impossible to tell if winter had ended or not, and the rain draped the shoreline like an indecisive curtain, she began her usual walk. Raindrops hitting the stones sounded as if something were breaking on the ground. Under the seawall, where the mossy steps began, she noticed a shiver of movement like a shadow. As she drew closer, the rain-darkened coat of a human body and hair soaked with seawater gained discernible lines. The man was not moving. Beyond the faint swell of his breath, he showed nothing to prove he existed. Ava knelt, the chill of the wet stone climbing up from her kneecaps. When the back of her hand touched the man's cheek, the skin's temperature, somewhere between ice and night, pressed against her fingers. His eyelids twitched. Then, with a ripple like a wave, his eyes opened. In his gaze was the emptiness of someone who hadn't yet found his place, a vacancy scanning the surroundings, wanting to grasp something, failing to find a name to hold. Ava considered calling for help, but on the man's face sat the wariness of someone who would not accept sirens entering this silence. The decision came with a troubling naturalness. She lifted him, moved his arm over her shoulder, and as they climbed the steps slowly, the weight of the rain turned the two of them into a shared sentence. When they reached the small flat above the bookshop cafe, the key turned with a click. Inside, the smell of coffee and old paper was joined by the odor of wet wool. Ava threw the blanket she kept at home over the man's shoulders. He looked around with the seriousness of a child learning the limits of rooms and the places of objects. Thoughts collided and retreated. On his face settled an expression often seen, yet rarely named, the white noise of memory. In the kitchen, Ava set water to boil. After a while, the rhythm of his breathing took shape, and his shoulders eased. Questions writhed in her head and bounced against the walls. Who was he? Where had he come from? Among the things found on him, there was no ID, only a dark patch like the mark where a wallet had been, and the rain-heavy pages of a notebook gone sodden. For the rest of the night, the small tasks of keeping house served as a kind of shelter. Steam from a hot shower filled the bathroom, the sheets were changed, and a dry sweatshirt left on the arm of the sofa settled shyly over the man's shoulders. Ava waited for the breathing of the guest stretched out in her living room to grow heavier. Near dawn, when the hiss of the rain yielded to a weary hush, her eyelids closed with a weight that betrayed her. The next day, the city opened with the temporary brightness of having been washed by water. As she moved among the shelves at the bookshop cafe, Ava's mind held steady in orbit around a single question. Who was the man, really? When she stopped by the flat around noon, there was a new order opened in the middle of the living room, like the mark of a place wiped clean, the way a presence leaves a trace on objects. A dried glass on the kitchen counter, a straightened blanket on the corner of the sofa, a small piece of seaweed left on the windowsill, as if someone wanted to keep the sea indoors as well. The man, beneath a temporary sky allotted to him, was looking out the window. The color of his eyes carried the tone of a sky after a storm. As the days followed one another, the need arose to give the man a name. Without an ED, even a name stood in the open like an orphaned suitcase. In the familiar posture of those trying to seize a splinter of memory, the man bent toward the emptiness within himself. Then, on the first dry page of the notebook, in neat handwriting, he left 2 words, Lucas Hale. Ava weighed the balance those 2 words carried. The name did not feel foreign to the lines of his face, the bend of his neck, the hesitancy in his gait. Lucas was now a silence with a name inside the room. Lucas's instincts carried the calm of those who know how to converse with objects. He could find a way to mend a broken shelf, understand why a window latch wouldn't catch, and soothe the stubbornness of the coffee machine with a brief allowance of quiet. Memory had somehow clung to the competencies required by the everyday. It simply didn't say where they had been learned, in which home they had been tried, beside whom they had become useful. At night, he wrote things on the new pages of the notebook, and by early morning he scratched them out and pulled the words back. Ava chose not to touch the notebook. That corner of the home was declared a boundary belonging to Lucas's emptiness. A city is a ground for feelings. Brighton's bond with the sea folds the sound of waves into everyday life. Ava divided the rhythm of her solitary walks with Lucas's quiet presence. Even walking side by side, they trusted the ambiguity of a language they did not speak. It proved true that a person's getting used to another person often rests not on words, but on rhythms. The length of the morning coffee, evening curtains drawn halfway, the way steam left on the bathroom mirror is swept away. Ava realized that her normal was opening out with Lucas. Hearing someone's footsteps at home, the growing number of notes on the fridge, a new pair appearing on the bottom shelf of the shoe rack. All of it was the small stones that fill the interior of a life. Those stones did not hurt her foot when she stepped on them. They promised a surface sturdy enough to bear weight. After the night when the emptiness inside Lucas collided with another emptiness, it began to fill in, blur by blur. One morning, jammed among the books being packaged in the back room of the bookshop cafe, an industry magazine had gotten stuck in the odd fate of being forgotten on a shelf. On the cover, a cold headline about an empire already taken over, and in the corner, a last name that felt familiar, Hale. Lucas held his gaze on the magazine for a brief moment, then chose the safer route of leaving it where it was. The pieces were not ready to be assembled yet. At night, shadows moved across the dim light of a phone screen. Sitting at the table with the muffled patience of someone listening to a ringtone, Lucas bent toward the locked drawer of his own past, as if trying to remember the password to an email account. For the truth, even when it insists on hiding, leaves signs of where it stays. Light seeping under a door, a scratch forgotten on the edge of glass, a signature repeated across the pages of a notebook. Lucas finally managed to shift a small brick in the wall of his mind. Behind that brick appeared rows of other bricks ready to be persuaded. Lucas Hale was the covert CEO of a London-based investment technology company, Hale Dynamics. His invisibility had been a joint strategy for the company's and his own safety, moves that masked his identity during a partnership crisis some time ago had removed him from sight for a while. The body found on the rain-pounded stone steps on the Brighton shore was the result not only of an accident, but also of a planned disappearance. His memory had truly gone cloudy at one point. Then the cloudiness had become a controlled quiet. The home he found was the single variable Lucas hadn't calculated. Ava's world had a softness that knew how to shelter things determined to be lost. What keeps a person in a place is often not the words that leave a mouth, but the testimony objects keep offering. Lucas fell under the soothing allure of that testimony. The notebook filled at night with more orderly lines. As he looked out at the sea from the window, his thoughts zigzagged between the company's board and the thin dust in Ava's home. Lucas began to believe he could carry both at once. When spring neared and the shadows of gulls stretched across the stone pavements, the order inside the home showed signs of permanence. A marriage decision settled like a flame that slowly grows at the end of a quiet spark. The modesty of the celebration didn't cast a shadow on the weight of the feeling. In a simple city office hall, with daylight falling on the paperwork and a few witnesses bearing witness, the opening of a new page for two people was certified. Ava Whitmore and Lucas Hale found a strange balance in the side-by-side pairing of their surnames. Marriage gave Ava an unexpected elasticity. New responsibilities layered onto her normal flowed at a manageable intensity. Evening tables, books gathered together, small rituals multiplying inside the home established a kind of liturgy. Lucas advanced the stages of his return to the company in slow, invisible steps. Each trip back to the office made it surprisingly harder to leave Brighton. Ava's presence was like a shore that dulled the sharpness of work. In the first week of summer, Brighton's familiar wind laid a warmer line over the city. Customers entering through the bookshop cafe door carried the smell of the sea within them as they wandered the shelves. After closing one evening, Ava shut the cash drawer and remembered the magazine left among the shelves. Again, the magazine stood before her, with the Hale name on the cover. This time, she did not postpone looking at the inner pages. In an interview, they spoke of the crisis era's invisible leader. At the height of the turmoil, the CEO's disappearance and simultaneous strategic maneuvers. The interview did not reveal the CEO's identity. It only said that different sources pointed to the same person. Ava left the magazine on the armrest of the chair. At home, Lucas's notebook stood on the corner shelf of the living room. Even after the wedding, it had remained a protected space. Ava had chosen not to touch it and felt proud of that choice. But that evening, pride gave way to a harder feeling, the necessity of knowing. The notebook drew her with a troubling allure. She set her finger to the edge of a page and opened it. On the pages were a meeting room plan in Barcelona, the hours of a bank lobby in Zurich, dates of a conversation with a lawyer in London, each accompanied by notes. The language of the notes revealed an appetite Lucas had dared to reclaim after coming out of the darkness of memory. A few pages later, a date overlapped with the night Ava had found Lucas in Brighton. Beside it, a small mark. It implied a disappearance that had been planned. In later pages, Hale dynamics recurred like the time-spanned echo of a last name. Ava did not close the notebook. Inside her spread a quiet fracture that told of things being moved out of place. At first, the fracture felt like an emptiness sensed in the belly. Then it rose toward her chest and became a formless knot in her throat. The testimony of the objects in the home switched all at once to a new language. The steel of the kitchen knife seemed brighter, the corner of the sofa harsher. The photograph on the wall couldn't carry the lightness of the day when they had stood side by side. That night, a soft wind settled over Brighton. For a time, looking at the sea from the window found a new meaning. The movement of the waves took on the same rhythm as a person looking into themselves. Ava put the notebook back. On the table, she left a small piece of paper. Beside a smudged ink stain were a few phrases in scraps. The words were not spoken aloud, but they insisted on being heard. In the morning, Lucas felt the order inside the home had diminished. A pair missing from the bottom shelf of the shoe rack, an empty drawer in the bedroom, a hair tie not in its place in the bathroom. It was one of those moments when absence occupies space as presence does. The paper left on the table was a voiceless bulletin. Lucas picked it up and folded it. He did not put it in his pocket. The air inside the home first grew heavy, as on the day he had been found, then turned into a season he did not yet know by name. Ava boarded the first train, heading north of the city. Outside the window, the land slid by, puddles carrying the sky upside down, tree trunks showing off their rain-blackened bark. She did not have a large suitcase, only a few days' clothes, a book taken from the bookshop cafe, and a small notebook. Brighton's order ceded its place to the liberty of being unplaced. After a while, the road left the shore. The harsh lines of a higher geography appeared. In her mind, Ava searched for a place the way a finger traces a map. A neglected boarding house in a quiet, small, nameless town became the first stop in the work of rebuilding herself. That same afternoon, Lucas went to London. His footsteps echoed through the corridors of the company, joining the chorus formed by unfinished meetings, files awaiting decisions, and bridled egos. The walls of Hale Dynamics carried the echo of strategies tired of being repeated, while Lucas's mind stayed fixed on the void left inside a small house outside the city. He touched the new pages of the notebook he carried with him as if he had never written at all. His fingers slid along the edge of a thought he couldn't shape. The days began to flow within two separate settings. In the northern town, Ava volunteered at the library. She held on to the patience of those who teach letters where to stand. Reading hours were organized for adults. She remembered again the primal power of opening the first page of a novel together, how it introduces people to one another. The landlord's cat slipped into her room in the evenings and slept at her feet. The sounds passing through the thin walls of the boarding house repeated each night at the same hour, in the same order. The rhythm of the town gave a measured confidence to Ava's pulse. Within his company, Lucas used his invisibility one last time to establish a new order. He handed over management to a team he trusted. He drew his own signature into the background and took refuge in the subtlety of seeming both present and absent. When he returned to Brighton, the inside of the home was waiting like a frozen film frame. A half-used jar of spice in the kitchen, an open book in the living room, a faded wind chime tucked to the edge of a pot on the balcony. That evening, watching the sea through the window, he understood that recalling a lost thing was not possible. Some things could only be carried. Summer didn't last long in Ava's town. Autumn arrived early, the streets filled with the always a bit mournful hue of yellow leaves. A bulletin board went up at the library. Locals left small notes inside the books they brought. Most notes contained kind repetitions, small hints about how a sentence could be carried from one person to another, from one place to another. As Ava walked slowly among the shelves at closing time, she brushed the edges of the pages with her fingertips. Paper often gives a person a strange courage. In London, Lucas founded a charitable trust. Its aim was to support literacy and local libraries. A portion of the funds was reserved for small towns in the north. Ava's name did not appear in the trust's documents. Lucas drew an invisible line and chose to stay behind it. A few months later, a small grant reached the library where Ava worked. The librarian announced it with a thank you note pinned to the board. There was no name on the note, only a brief sentence of gratitude, written as if in a low voice. Passing by the board, Ava felt a familiar pulse beating inside the letters, but she did not set her fingers on them. Winter wrapped the town with a weariness all its own. The radiators in the boarding house broke down and hummed through the night. That hum settled into a sound that accompanies the fragile beginnings of new lives. Ava sat at the edge of her bed and listened to the rhythm of her breath. She noticed the ache that had opened space in her chest was easing. The human body, given enough time, turns most pains into something that resembles itself. Living with pain becomes possible by learning to break its weight into smaller pieces. Ava walked the path through the pain slowly and carefully. In Brighton, in a house by the sea, a light in a window stayed on for long stretches. The more Lucas made his work invisible, the more he kept his home visible. His routines were rearranged around Ava's absence. Morning coffee at the same hour, the evening window at the same angle. The pages of the notebook stayed blank for a while, then filled with notes on trust projects, funds for a small municipal library in Brighton, reading evenings organized by the bookshop cafe, a temporary book kiosk set up by the water. Lucas tried to write the new sentence of his life alone. Years didn't pass. Only the seasons changed places. One spring morning, school children walked to the library in the little northern town. Ava stood in the doorway and listened to the sound of their steps. Among them, a small girl with reading difficulties placed her feet more slowly than the others. Ava walked beside the girl. She matched her pace to the girl's rhythm. When the library door opened, the smell of paper and dust inside spread like the scent of one of the most essential ways of living a person needs while alive. That afternoon, another package arrived at the library from the Trust. It was full of children's books, bright covers, new letters on the inner pages. The librarian set the box on the table and slid it toward Ava. Inside the box was a bookmark with a small seashell attached to its corner. The shell looked as if it had been touched by someone who spoke the language of Brighton's shore. Ava held the shell in her hand. In the curving chambers of a shell, there is a strange hum that calls a person to itself. She listened to it, then placed the bookmark inside the little girl's new book. In the Brighton evening, Lucas watched the place where the light falling on the sea fractured. In that breakage was a line resembling the way a person loses other people, sometimes clearer, sometimes more blurred. Lucas opened the notebook and turned to a new page. In neat handwriting, he wrote a short line. Nothing good ever ends entirely. He added no explanation around the sentence. It accepted the burden of existing on its own. In the northern town, when evening came, Ava sat by the stove. A cold that seeped to the marrow came in through the window, but inside the home it was warm. On the table were notes for the next day's library event. On one page of her notebook, the word Brighton was written not only as a place name, but like a sound. Ava drew a frame around the word. She sifted what needed to remain inside the frame and the memories that should not spill beyond it. Then she closed the notebook and turned out the light. Sometimes a person learns to leave a life on one shore and go on living on another. This is a form of loss, but also a way of building. The story of Ava and Lucas resembled a bridge hanging between two shores, not walked upon, yet not destroyed. Waves kept striking the bridge's pillars. One pillar remained in Brighton, the other in the small town up north. Both survived, but they could not remain within the same life. As summer neared, the metal tongue of a wind chime trembled lightly on Brighton's shore. Lucas stepped out onto the balcony and listened to the chime. The sound was like the steps of two people who had once walked inside the same home. When he went back in, everything that remained inside the home was in its proper place. Order had become the accepted form of loneliness. Evening in Brighton spread a water-tinged light across the sky. Lucas stood at the window. On the horizon, the line of the sea stretched like a threshold that turns all stories into the same sentence. Up north, children leaving school scattered across the small town square. The library door closed. Ava turned the key, and the lock slid into place with a familiar tone. The sun took on the yellow of an early evening. Ava rolled the small seashell she carried in her pocket between her fingers. The hum hidden in its curves resembled everything that passes through a person and goes unnamed. As she headed home, a short sentence crossed her mind. Sometimes loss is open places where a person can go on living without killing herself. She did not say the sentence aloud. Inside her, it remained with a weight equal to living. 2 cities, 2 people, 2 separate lives, 2 different shores of the same sea. 2 rhythms once accustomed to each other inside the same home continued to play a part. The waves carried the same music to both. Each recognized it, neither accompanied it, and life, as always, was completed by what it lacked.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.